What is the scariest, creepiest outdoors experience you've ever had? Part 2. Please like and subscribe to support this channel. Back in high school, me and my friend went to the local park to smoke some weed. We were smoking for about 5 minutes when I noticed somebody watching us. I thought they might be calling the police, so me quickly moved. Later we find a new spot, and about 2 minutes later I see the lame guy lurking, but this time I notice what he is doing. This creep is following us around the park while fapping with a backpack. Having no idea what was in the backpack, we split so fast. Me and my mates were about 14 to 15 and slept alone in a tent in a small forest, and left the tent with our stuff in there to go get pizza from the little village they all lived in. We then came back to the tent, and one of the friends found a knife right by the opening, and another friend said that he'd seen it before we left and thought it was nothing. This was a lie. We were obviously really scared and didn't enter any of the 3 separate compartments in the tent, just sat there and waited to see if we would hear anything. A couple of minutes went by and we decided it was nothing and started entering the compartments. Right when I had pulled down the zipper of our compartment about halfway, a man screamed while jumping out of the compartment. That man was my friend's dad. The knife was a plastic toy knife with fake blood on it. I was so scared that I nearly shat myself. It's by far the scariest thing I've experienced to this day. Anybody that has been on the Navajo reservation has either probably heard of some creepy things or have experienced pretty creepy things. Namely skinwalkers. I have only seen one. Here is my story. I come from a small town in northern Arizona that's sandwiched between the Paiute Reservation to the north and the U.S.'s largest Navajo reservation to the south. My high school being so small, a 1A high school that has, on average, 80 students enrolled every year, always had to travel south about 5 to 10 hours one way to play another high school in any sport. This means that we traveled a lot on the Navajo res. And we also usually stayed at hotels when we would head out to play and come home in the morning, but this trip was a little bit different. I remember the basketball coach saying that the school didn't have enough money to put up the teams in a hotel that trip, so we were going to be on the road for a total of about 12 hours. I was the only male senior to play basketball that season. We had just got done playing our game and headed home on our bus, Big Blue. We were headed out and it wasn't long, about 2 hours of driving, before we had entered the res. By this time, everyone was asleep, with it being about 2 in the morning. When we had crossed the res's border, I noticed the bus driver had sped up and was now going about 85 miles per hour. I thought this was a little weird because he never exceeded the speed limit, at least not in my high school career. For some reason, I couldn't fall asleep like the rest of my teammates, and I just sat at the back of the bus staring out across the desolate desert landscape that was lit up by the full moon. As I looked out, I could see a figure running towards the bus at an angle of pursuit, and keeping up with the bus at 85 miles per hour. As the figure got closer, I saw that it was a humanoid form. As a matter of fact, it looked exactly like a human, only that the face was painted half black and half white with glowing eyes. Glowing eyes like a rabbit's eyes reflecting light from a spotlight. I immediately thought, holy crap, it's a skinwalker. The skinwalker ran up to the edge of the road and just kept up pace with the bus, hurtling sagebrush and rocks while staring at me. After I made eye contact with the thing, I could not look away. It was as if something was holding my head and eyes in place. The skinwalker just smiled at me, this inhuman smile that went ear to ear, showing crooked, yellow, pointed teeth. I felt like I was going to throw up, and I was panicking through the whole ordeal. The skinwalker started to crumple down onto all fours, still keeping up with the bus. I could see his bones crack and reform. Hair started appearing all over the skinwalker's body, and in about 3 seconds was now a coyote, and it ran off back into the desert out of view. As soon as it was gone, I ran to the onboard bathroom and puked a mixture of food and blood. I didn't want to tell anyone for fear they would think I was crazy. I confided in my Navajo friend. She told me that I needed to see the chief, who also happened to be a friend of mine, and get a blessing. I saw him the next school day in the parking lot. He just came up to me and mumbled something in Navajo while waving a feathered scepter-like thing, turned around, got in his truck and drove away. To this day, I haven't seen another skinwalker. It might be due to the fact I moved away from that town and res, and, if I do have to go south, I go around. Way around. I saw a skinwalker on my way home from a high school basketball game. Scariest, I guess, would be getting chased across a logging site by a pissed-off moose. I'm working in the bush for the summer, and wind up going out to redo a survey at one location. I get there, walk off to one side of the cut block, and there's a little herd of moose off at the edge of the trees. They see me and scamper into the bush, all but one that stays just out of cover. I'm pretty excited, as I had never seen moose in the wild before, so when this moose calls at me, I decide to call back. Apparently I'm a good mimic, because it comes out across the block towards me a little bit and honks again. So I honk in return, and it comes even closer. I assume that I was either saying, "I want your women," or, "Hey baby, come here and gimme some sugar," because this big fucker of a male moose, no antlers, it wasn't that time of year, just keeps on coming towards me. I started making other noises, swearing, cursing, slapping my shovel on rocks, and it did not stop, and sped up. Needless to say, a half-ton of pissed-off sausage on the hoof is pretty intimidating, so I finally turned tail and broke the world record for the 100-yard dash across logging slash and only turned around when I was behind my truck. The moose had stopped halfway, and then buggered off. TLDR. Moose are evil. A friend and I were walking through the metro parks in the suburbs of Cleveland, just hiking and enjoying a warm summer day in northern Ohio. There is a river, the Rocky River, that runs through part of the metro parks, and we were following the banks of the river, casting a line in from time to time for steelhead trout. As we headed further into the park system, we came upon a small spot of land on the other side of the river that was covered in lily of the valley, with no downtrodden paths or signs of human interference. We took off our socks and boots, crossed the river, and sat down on the embankment to dry our feet. We set up our fishing poles, put our boots back on, and headed into the Valley of Lilies. Being careful not to trample the flowers, and trying our best to leave nothing but footprints, we were being relatively quiet as we took in the sights and smells of this small, inaccessible embankment. The lilies weren't in full bloom, but the air was full of their sweet scent when we got to the bottom of the cliff. Looking up to the top, we could see houses, and we saw the debris and waste that these people had cast down the cliff over years, possibly over decades. Old tires, aluminum cans. Some will pull tabs, a large piece of cast iron patio furniture, mostly garbage and detritus, buried deep beneath the sea of lilies and undergrowth. The scant few trees above provided little filter from the sun, providing a welcome warmth as we took a rest on a fallen log to examine one of the older beer cans. We were sitting on the same log, facing opposite directions when I heard a FFFFFF* noise. I turned to my buddy and asked if he was alright. "Yeah, I'm fine." Thought that was why, FFFFFFF* again. This time from behind me, where I was just facing a few seconds ago. FFFFFF, another one, from my 3 o'clock. We leapt to our feet and stood back to back, not knowing what or where this noise was coming from. FFFFFFFFFFFFFF* distinct in their tone, and having spent a lot of time in the woods as a kid, I knew what they were after a few more iterations of the noise. Deer. I am a peaceful man, a lover of all animals, but I know the sound of a pissed-off deer from watching them fight over corn and salt licks at my parents' house. "Shit, we're in a deer bed," whispered as we remained motionless, then they began to appear. One doe at first, a big girl at that, probably upwards of 300 pounds. Then another, and another, and another, and we were surrounded. "A what?" my friend implored me, his booming voice cut back to a trembling whisper. If animals can smell fear, these deer knew we were scared shitless. A fucking deer bed. Does will run in mobs with their fawns, and we're in their fucking house. I didn't have to explain much further than that, as my friend had already determined that he was surrounded on all sides, as was I. The deer were encircling us, trapping us. Now, if you don't know anything about deer, they are herbivores who are, usually, not territorial nor aggressive. However, when provoked, they will stomp their hooves and snort, stick the hair up on their backs, and wave their adorable little white tails around like a drunkard with a hula hoop. The first stomp came a few seconds after our realization that we were, in fact, surrounded. They began moving in, on all sides, stomping, snorting, flailing those cute little tails, and showed no signs of backing down. Like I said before, I am a peaceful man. In my 31 years of life, I have never harmed an animal that I didn't intend to eat. Humans, but never animals, as I believe them to be inherently innocent, but I digress. These does are literally a mob, closing in on us slowly, so my fight or flight kicked in and it ended up a combination of both. I let out a guttural scream from the pit of my churning stomach, grabbed the biggest stick I could find, yelled, "Fucking run," to my friend, and I ran straight at the biggest, gnarliest looking doe that was blocking the way back to the embankment and our fishing gear. F in a stomp, the bitch didn't even budge. I threw the stick at her, mostly out of fear that she wasn't afraid of me. Well, that got her attention, and she bolted, which led the rest of the mob to follow suit. The ground was probably trembling under the stampede of the mob, but there was no way for me to tell as we were running faster than we've ever ran in our lives. As we neared the clearing of the embankment, our fishing tackle, and ultimately our salvation, I turned back to make sure the mob wasn't following us. They were stoic, standing watch in the patch of lilies as we hightailed it out of there. When we reached the embankment, we both looked back one last time to make sure we had time to catch our breath. Two tiny, spotted fawns were standing a few meters from where we were stood when we were being surrounded. Lesson learned: don't fuck with mama deer. I was on an island in the middle of the Pacific, doing my first ever project away from home. There was maybe 30 people on this 3-mile island and most had finished their respective jobs and headed into camp for the night. My job at the time was to hike around after dark to make sure the coconut crabs weren't eating all my ant traps. They are shy, curious creatures and will steal stuff when you're not looking to rip apart and sniff or chew, so that night I had a large male crab as my only company in the palm forest. When we reached a break in the trees, I stopped and looked up at the stars for a second. And froze. Somewhere, in the pitch-black darkness overhead was the freakiest goddamn sound, and it was getting louder. It was coming towards us. It literally sounded like a fussy baby crying. Overhead. Flying towards us. I looked at my crab friend and he looked at me with the same freaked-out expression, and I bolted. I ran straight for the research tent. Sometime before I reached it, my brain must have kicked back on, because the first thing I said to another person was, "Is there a bird that sounds like a flying ghost baby?" Yes, there is. It's called a wedge-tailed shearwater and it freaked me the F**k out. Here's a link to an MP3 of its call. I'm on my phone, so forgive me if it doesn't work. Creepy. Here, I posted this to No Sleep a couple years ago, but it's a completely true story. A couple of years ago, two friends and I, we'll call them D and J, went to a place called Look Rock. It's a concrete observation tower at the top of Chiloe Mountain in Blount County, Tennessee. To get to the tower, you park in a small pull-off, then walk a paved trail half a mile up the mountain. I've been up to this tower many times, and there's usually some kind of energy in the air. You can't see it, but you can feel it. It's like the woods themselves have acquired sentience, and they're just barely tolerating your presence. Anyway, this particular trip was eerily quiet. Typically in the woods you can hear woodsy sounds. Cicadas, wind rustling in the trees, the occasional animal, but this night was silent. Going back to my simile, it's like the sentient woods were terrified of something, and were paralyzed with fear. The trip up the mountain was uneventful, apart from the general air of creepiness. We went up to the tower, and shot the proverbial shit for a couple of hours. Finally, around 3-ish, we decided it was time to wrap it up. We began the trip back down. At the base of the tower, there's a couple of flattish boulders, about 6 feet or so in diameter, placed as a decoration. What I saw on the boulder was the start of a terrifying night. Nobody else in my group noticed, but squatted on the boulder was a solid black form, about 4 to 5 feet tall, with deeply glowing red eyes. It stared at us for a second, then vanished into thin air. Assuming my eyes were just fucking with me, I reluctantly carried on past the boulders. The feeling of uneasiness followed us up until about the 30% point. On this trail, there's a point where the trail turns 90 degrees to the right. When going back down, the trail you're walking on continues forward, but it's just an ATV access for the rangers. This is in the Smoky Mountain National Park. About 20 feet or so before the turn, I notice an extra pair of footsteps. There were only 3 of us, but 4 sets of footsteps. I stopped and looked, and right behind Jay was a 7-foot-tall-ish heat distortion, like when you look over a flaming grill on a summer day. It was vaguely human-shaped. As with the form on the boulder, after looking at it for a few seconds, it vanished. At this point, we double-timed it back to the car. They hadn't seen it, but they felt it. Halfway down the trail, there's a spot where one tree has fallen into the split trunk of another tree, so it forms kind of a triangle against the ground. At the top of the triangle, the same crouched black form with deep red eyes. Again, it vanished after looking at it. We made it back down to the truck, everything in our minds screaming, "Run." We did about 90 down Foothills Parkway until we made it back to the highway. From there, the trip was uneventful. We dropped Jay off at his house, and proceeded to Dee's house, about 15 minutes away. As I was pulling out of Dee's driveway, his phone rang. He answered it, turned pale, and flagged me down. Something had happened at Jay's house. We booked it back to Jay's, where we found every light in his house on. We went in, and found him in bed, with a Bible in one hand, and a 45 in the other. Jay's bedroom faces a streetlight. Also, in his room, he has a nightlight, a clock, and a stereo, all of which keep his room fairly well lit. He went to bed, then the room had suddenly gone dark. He could still see the streetlight, the clock, the stereo, etc., and they were still lit, but they cast no glow into the room. He said he couldn't even see his hand in front of his face. He went on to say that something had put its hand on his throat and growled in his face, then left. By the time we got there, it had already left. Just to be sure, we lined the doors and windows with salt. I had read somewhere that salt kept stuff away. We never heard from the thing again. To this day I have no idea what it was, but it's what I picture when someone uses the word imp. We've been back to the tower several times since, but it's never been the same. The woods have always seemed quiet and afraid. TLDR. Something followed us back.